Thank you all for joining. All I can see in front of me is the presentation, so I look forward to seeing your faces and engaging in the conversations shortly. As Louise said, I'm Matt Illich. I'm co-founder and CEO at GreenWorkx, and I'll tell you a bit about us just before we kick off. But to frame the conversation for today in terms of our agenda, as I said, we're going to cover what GreenWorkx is very quickly, but then actually get on top of what is happening in retrofit skills and workforce. What does this mean in terms of the challenges and the need for new talent that we'll have over the coming years as we seek to decarbonize the built environment, the space that you're all very involved in? What does it look like at scale? Because many of these projects in the next kind of calendar and future fiscal years will all be happening at the same time at a scale that was unprecedented, at least in recent history. So that'll be an interesting challenge for all of us. And how to combine that with social value. And I'll give you a flavor of some of the work that we've done and how it might inform, hopefully, some of your thinking going forward as well. So briefly on me, as I said, co-founder and CEO at GreenWorkx. GreenWorkx is a climate edtech startup powering the skilled and trade workforce for net zero. So the company was founded in 2022 by myself and my co-founders. And the idea behind it being that we have this massive challenge before us around decarbonization, energy transition, and net zero, but also a huge opportunity to create inclusive growth and jobs for hundreds of thousands of people in the UK and millions of people around the globe. And not only is that a massive social and economic benefit, but it's also a massive necessity because we need these people to be able to do the work that you are all too familiar with. So everything from doing retrofit assessment, ultimately through to doing installation of measures and all the spaces in between, like speaking to residents about low carbon solutions, renewables, and other sort of opportunities. So in terms of GreenWorkx, I'll give you more of a flavor about what we do in the course of the presentation. But before setting up the company, my career spans mostly being in and out of the public sector, in and around public and social policy as well. So my last job, I worked at a national enterprise called Catch-22 across welfare to work, apprenticeship, skills and employability, as well as other programs like criminal justice and so on. So I have been on panels talking about social value in the past. And before that, also worked in government itself, so both as a special advisor in Number 10 on home affairs policy, as well as in regional government in London for the mayor's office between 2009 and 2012. So I have a relatively well-rounded but general view of the landscape of social policy, welfare to work and skills. And I think when it comes to this particular challenge, all of you will excel on the question of the built environment and the topic of how you decarbonize and build retrofit projects and so on. But what I'm hoping to bring here is a bit of a conversation around people and skills and how you get the people to the skills and ultimately help those people engage in supply chains with the work in a very matter of fact and very pragmatic and practical way. So just to start a bit on the question of this emergency, and it's not to cause any unnecessary alarm, but effectively you will all know that we have a worsening climate crisis, global temperatures set to exceed, or if not already have exceeded 1.5 degrees this year, pre-industrial level, above industrial levels. And this is the first year that we're meant to be kind of passing that threshold. And that was what the Paris Agreement was meant to be preventing. And tipping points such as polar ice caps melting, the reversal of ocean currents, ice sheet collapsing, rainforest dieback, these are all the things that are actually the scary challenges before us, and they may be happening sooner than any of us expected. And we will have seen on our television screens the adverse climate impacts ranging from the shocking flooding in some areas all the way through to wildfires and droughts in others. And the relative volatility and unpredictability of this is what makes it so challenging to navigate. But of course, we all have to focus on the things that are before us and doing as much as we can do to move things forward in the energy transition as well as decarbonization. Reassuringly, $3 trillion are being spent on the energy transition globally. So these are investments captured in 2023 in renewables, energy efficiency, electrification, marking a significant rise in green expenditure. And actually, the things that you're all working on are a relatively small subset of that, but it's a global movement affecting all of the developed economies and also all developing economies as well. And it still feels like despite all of that investment, there is lots of uncertainty in the globe and lots of uncertainty over the climate transition and the energy transition in particular as to whether we are decarbonizing quickly in a scaled enough way. And so there are also growing trends in governments making commitments to net zero, but also trends in relatively quick rollbacks flowing from sometimes a lack of earnest and legal commitment, which, as you'll know, in the UK, we have through the legally binding commitment to net zero by 2050. Now, the other thing that isn't kind of often talked about is that globally, we also have a shortage and a contraction of workers. So we sometimes look at UK as where is unemployment today, where is worklessness, what's the plan for work saying, but effectively these investments are driving a growth for workers such as electricians. So in the US in the past 4 years, for example, we've had a shortage of 1 million electricians. And as all of you will know, these are roles that don't just manifest overnight. They take as much as 4 years to train, in some cases longer if we're talking about high voltage. And so in the context of electrifying everything, we need to be thinking ahead as to how we're going to get people into these industries. And of course, how we're going to train them to a level of competence to allow us to deliver these projects in sometimes very fast paced, scaled up and time bound ways. And recruitment challenges abound across supply chains already. So you'll know that construction itself is lacking significant trade skills, whether it's core bricklaying and dry lining, but also plumbing, heating, ventilation, all of the other things that form the bedrock of some of the talent that we need for retrofitting. And some of this is historic and structural. So it stems from our challenge of getting new people into these industries and, of course, giving them the conversion routes by which they can access the opportunities fairly quickly. And so it's the result of growing demand and a contracting workforce supply that leads us with what is known by us, and if you Google it, by one MP some time ago, as the green skills emergency. So this imbalance between the skills that we need to have and the workers that we need to have acts as a bottleneck because we are looking for this talent in the times, the places with the skills that we need. But sometimes if we're trying to do that all at the same time, we create constraints that means we can't get the projects that we need off the ground. And so it ends up being a genuine blocker to everything from at the infrastructure and kind of state level, building a nuclear power plant or grid decarbonization. And of course, in the context of what you're all trying to achieve, inability to actually get surveys done of homes, get into people's homes, start to kind of look at the opportunity of what measures to install, and ultimately install those measures effectively. So we have to act proactively and urgently around this question. And that's before we actually know what sort of opportunity we have, not necessarily to overcommit or to make commitments, but actually to just understand what it might be like and how to solve for it before we land ourselves in the zone of having to deliver, because it's going to be incredibly hard to do that in parallel whilst trying to stand up these projects at the same time. So just a bit more closer to home, how does this connect to retrofit? So 80% of buildings that we have will still be around in 2050, the day that net zero is meant to have been reached legally in this country. So, and you'll know that they account for 35% of all of our domestic UK emissions and 20% of emissions, but also 35% of our energy use. And so to meet net zero, we can't really get there without having a very serious look at the decarbonization of homes. Hundreds of thousands have already gone through that process through previous schemes such as warm homes as predecessors. But clearly this is just the beginning. And you will have seen various forecasts as to how quickly we have to move. I think there is some debate out there as to whether we need to decarbonize all of the stock of homes, some 27 million properties. But regardless of whether it's 27 million or 7 million or 3 million or somewhere in between, it's still a massive jump in an order of magnitude of where we need to be relative to where we are. Now, with every year that goes by where we're kind of slipping behind some of these objectives, we obviously need to do more and more and more in order to try and stem the flow of carbon into the atmosphere. And in so doing, we are accentuating and accelerating the need for retrofit demand. So if you look at these kind of bottlenecks as a small, medium, and large kind of challenge, the small challenge is if in April we all have to kick off our projects at the same time, where do we find the workers for that? The medium level challenge is if we need to decarbonize a certain number of homes over the next decade, how do we ensure that the workforce is there for doing so? And ultimately, there's also then a kind of global constraint and challenge where as we have populations that in some cases are contracting and getting older, we're starting to lose the kind of workers with the skills that we need. So in the context of retrofit, the forecast from the Construction Leadership Council is that anywhere between 250,000 and 500,000 new workers, ranging from kind of blue collar trade installer roles all the way up to retrofit surveyors and professionals, will be needed in order to drive this decarbonisation challenge. And it's impossible to land exactly on what that number is, but you can't get away without asking the question of where is the new talent going to come from? And how do you ensure that it has necessary skills to be able to hit the ground running as quickly as possible? And at the same time, we also need to continuously upskill our existing workforce in order to ensure that people are maintaining their standards and keeping pace with all the requirements of the new paths and other things that are coming down the line. So to summarize the challenges, the speed and scale that's huge. Is this compounding impact, or if we're falling behind, how do we do more of it? Our workforces are aging fast. The median age of a gas engineer is 55. The regulation is moving and demanding. So I mentioned PAS, and we can touch on it, but these requirements mean that people need to stay on top of how regulation is affecting their roles and affecting the projects that they're working on. Most of the market in terms of the employers are relatively small businesses. And so there needs to be a kind of a coordination opportunity of how we bring them together. And there are these huge regional disparities, which is that workers are not always where the work is. And so we need to think about how we create local opportunity to move people into the spaces of working with us. And just to give you a context of what happens when it doesn't work so well. So the targets set for the Green Homes Grant Voucher Scheme a few years back, some 314 million was spent, a total 1.5 billion budget, principally because we hadn't anticipated what that demand was going to look like, just in terms of spending the money down and ensuring that the workforce was there to install the measures. And actually then people start to question, well, what is happening with decarbonisation? Will it ever happen? And is this a kind of real industry, and so on? And so all of us collectively getting together and thinking about how do we anticipate these challenges before they are here next year is just a worthwhile expenditure of our time in order to avoid the worst kind of situation. So a bit more on what's specifically standing in the way of new talent. And this is the way that we kind of summarize it. And so low awareness of what retrofit is. Many individuals have a very limited understanding outside of obviously the kind of group that are on these webinars. The mainstay of the public is very slow to understand the relationship between insulation, decarbonisation, domestic heating reform, and of course jobs and what is needed for those jobs. So just low awareness overall. The term green skills and green jobs has actually become quite loaded because people don't believe politicians or generally kind of these promises of jobs being created until those jobs are seen by them and they've seen the opportunity, been able to seize the opportunity, and or know somebody that's been able to do the same. And sometimes this lack of awareness is also linked to the general challenges around science, technology, engineering, and math, so what was known as STEM. And it acts as a bit of a barrier to people to really engage with the space. It overshadows the opportunity that is actually possible. So previous campaigns have just not been kind of consistent. How many people outside of your immediate circle talk about retrofit assessor or coordinator or any other role as something that they are aware of and they kind of think about and potentially sort of aspire to it? And that's this kind of second challenge around attractiveness. So maybe incorrectly and unfairly, roles are perceived to be physically demanding, low paying, too inflexible or too volatile or risky because they are on fixed or temporary contracts or require self-employment. And so this really deters interest amongst young and diverse workers in particular. Gender stereotypes, construction, as we all know, is one of the least kind of diverse sectors out there, and so much more work has been done and continues to be done. But the frontline workforce is less than 1% female the last time I checked. So it gives you a flavor of what results from our inability to get new entrants in. Diversity in this context is a challenge that emerges from our inability to grow supply overall, as opposed to necessarily lacking in kind of diversity and inclusion schemes specifically. So how do we broaden inclusion and inclusiveness around where we cast the net to look for talent? And then beyond that, think about career progression. So some great work has been done by the National Retrofit Hub and by the Installation Assurance Authority around career routes, career progression, and ladders to help people understand that retrofit is a spectrum of different professions and trades that can be engaged with and create, potential for a portfolio style career across a range of different projects and so on. So there is genuinely an opportunity here, we feel, to elevate the prestige and status of these roles amongst the kind of general public, and in particular among younger people. And some of the things I'll be referencing later give you a sense of how you might go about doing that in local areas and bringing that conversation forward. The other piece is that sometimes the outside in routes to becoming qualified, competent, and employed can be fuzzy. So roles themselves occasionally not as well defined as they could be as sort of training pathways to different certification groups. Nothing fundamentally wrong with this. But again, if you put yourself in the shoes of a person that is trying to make sense of which steps to take, either transitioning from an old career to this new career, or even making steps for the first time, how do you really boil it down to the lowest common denominator? Tell me what I need to do in order to become qualified, competent, and move forward. And in particular, how might I connect my pre-existing skills, knowledge, and experience to what I'm doing here? So actually, so many of these roles have a high index on customer service interaction and interfacing with potentially residents, and actually some technical knowledge. Of course, prior technical knowledge is hugely valuable. And so what are some of those prior skills that can be translated to come alongside the qualifications to sort of build that competence? And so much of this also then needs to filter into our education and skill system. So many of those, if you like, scaled up programs in colleges and universities and elsewhere are still not majoring on what we need in respect to kind of green qualifications and retrofit qualifications specifically. And there are also, of course, the financial barriers that stand in the way for people becoming qualified. So whichever course you're looking at, if you're in the kind of self-funded route, it can be very challenging to take yourself through, not least because actually you're unsure as to what the upside might be on the other side. And I've also heard the inverse criticism that people qualify, they pay their way through the qualification, and then they look to get self-employment or employment, but there hasn't been too much foresight and forethought given to how we get them properly job ready once they've got the qualification. So all of that is true as well. And then finally on job availability. So some of it is just about where jobs are posted, back to the point I made earlier, which is that the majority of employers employing retrofit talent, so both trades and professions, are relatively small companies. And that is not a criticism, is just a fact. And it's true for the wider economy as a whole. 61% of all employment is in companies that are small to mid-sized businesses by classification, and is particularly dominant in the built environment, construction and home building sort of sector. So there's then a kind of basic question of like, where do I find out about these jobs? And then how do I match where that job is to where I am at, both in terms of physical location as well as the prior knowledge, skills and experience that I have. And then also how visible is this, and how familiar am I with the employer on the other side? So we should not underestimate that actually in an age of relative workforce scarcity, so we have relatively low unemployment, relatively high economic inactivity, lots of choice in the economy around what people might be able to do. And that's especially true after the COVID pandemic, when people have been more selective as to what they do. We shouldn't underestimate just how hard it is to persuade people to opt for certain choices, and how much shaping needs to happen there, and collaboration between employers, recruitment, educators, and consistent communication about where those jobs are and why they're great jobs and why people should take them forward. So I've talked quite a bit about the different constraints and challenges, and actually, as we look at the kind of the next horizon, that is where the kind of, if you like, the opportunity lies for all of us. So all of you are on this webinar because of exactly warm homes, whether it's a social housing fund under a local grant. But the explicit kind of goal here is that it's the public sector that's really driving the change, and it's right for the public sector to drive the change, because government is always the kind of first mover in a space that doesn't yet have true consumer awareness and consumer adoption. So I don't need to read what's on the slide. It'll be way too familiar for you. But basically, the core objective behind the social housing fund is also then mirrored in the wider goals of the UK Labour government's commitment of some 6 billion plus to various schemes, including this one and the local grant, as well as the public sector decarb scheme. And this is to drive the decarbonisation in a specific segment of our built environment, and they're targeted programs that we're playing out between now and 2028. And so we need to really be quite close and on top of exactly how and where that is happening, so that we can also be on top of its execution, not just to ensure that the money gets spent, but more importantly, that the measures get done, resulting in all those benefits that we'll be familiar with to individual residents, to homeowners, to not to homeowners, but to landlords, and ultimately to the to industry and to environment as well. So this substantial government funding is the opportunity, and it marries up to the challenge I mentioned earlier about the kind of workforce bottleneck. But the other facet of the opportunity is how social value implicitly or explicitly interacts with that. So to kind of explain what I mean by implicitly, if you've seen, and you, of course, you will have seen the application for the social housing grant for the strategic fund, there is a very categorical ask around how are you thinking about supply chain, how are you thinking about building the workforce, how are you thinking about training new people into space. So that is a true ode from the department to understanding where are we going to get this talent from and how are we going to maximize kind of benefit and opportunity. But there is also the application of the 2012 Social Value Act to encourage the introduction in some more tactical local authority retrofit activity. And this is just an example from a retrofit service framework from One LA, talking about how can we embed social value in procurement to tackle inequity, boost local economies, foster community well-being. And so these tenders, then both the warm homes, social homes version, as well as some more localized versions of the kind of local grant, talk about how we're going to create economic opportunity for local people. And you can look at that through the lens of sort of social value and economic value in the Social Value Act, but also importantly, marrying up to the point at the beginning of the presentation, which is that we just need this local workforce in any event. There is no scenario in which we are going to be awash with people that can kind of do this work. So we should think about intentionally creating local opportunity, and not just because it benefits local people and local communities, but also because it benefits local supply chain and ultimately project delivery. Now, that is sometimes a difficult thing to kind of marry up, and I'll tell you a bit more about how to think about that. But for the time being, just to kind of illustrate the value of thinking about this kind of procurement in this vein, is that we can really emphasize kind of outcomes over outputs. So the crucial thing here is to set these expectations, not to over-engineer, but to ask people bidding through the course of procurement what they might be able to deliver and how they're thinking about this, and ultimately to kind of bake that into the relationship of implementation and think about, well, great that we kind of agreed to this in the bid. Now, how are we actually going to go about attracting, helping people discover, helping them learn, helping them train, and helping them get into the work through self-employment or employment, so that we can also deliver on these projects, but also have people coming from the local community where relevant. And so these questions about how do we introduce those measures that are both about ultimately, yes, project delivery, but before that, thinking about the attraction piece and a social value piece and a skilling piece as well. And it sounds very complicated and to some extent, a further bit of friction and pain in what are already going to be quite complex projects. But I think investing in it relatively early, and in some cases, companies we've been speaking to, we've been encouraging them to invest in it now, as I said, not to start hiring and training people, but to start talking to people and thinking about where they might come from, so that they can get ahead of the crunch in January and beyond of everyone trying to find this workforce at the same time. So a bit on what I want to tell you, and this is not to necessarily showcase our work per se, but it's more to really touch on how we've thought about trying to navigate these constraints from a supply side perspective, i.e., where is this new talent going to come from, and what are some of the interventions that we need to put in order to really move them to a point where they can take up roles, in this case as domestic energy or actually RAs in the context of supply chains and do so effectively. And these can be people who are young people leaving college, or it can be people who are from job center kind of customers or armed forces returners, or it could be people who are already, say, local authority employees who want to go from working in planning but transition into project managing some of these kinds of projects. So the actual use case we found covers a broad umbrella of kind of people from different backgrounds, be that unemployment or underemployment or prior employment but career transition. But actually the steps along the way are relevant because what we're trying to do is shape the architecture by which people become qualified and ultimately kind of competent and available to take up that work. So in terms of what we've been doing, the first is positioning. So where are you going out looking for these people? And we've done things that are both digital and things that are completely analog, ranging from being in job centers and presenting in colleges all the way through to running campaigns on TikTok and Instagram and some of those platforms that young people spend more time on than they do on LinkedIn. We created an online onboarding process. So actually a generic process that says, hey, if you want to learn about becoming one of these people, follow this kind of breadcrumb trail and tell us actually about you and who you are today, so that then helps us understand how long you have to journey to become a qualified and ultimately competent retrofit assessor. And so we do everything from onboarding people through to then doing some of these eligibility checks. And they are both practical things like right to work and do people have a driving license, but also knowing where in the country they are. And on the back of that, then kind of really understanding, well, do they have prior relevant qualifications that might shorten the time frame in which they become qualified through this and so on. So really getting a full picture of who this person is in order to shape our understanding of where it might go next. And just for a bit of context, overall in the past couple of years, we have just shy of 10,000 people who want a job in one of these spaces. Many of them, north of 400, have completed a level 2 or level 3 qualification, working principally with our partners. So people like Energy Trust and others who have had funding to deliver this kind of training. But it's always been with the view that we're opening up access to people that might not otherwise be able to self-fund through the market. So we've amassed quite a large pool of people that want to work in this kind of space. Now, with a limited number in the past kind of 3 months, we've managed to take 20 through a level 3 domestic energy assessor qualification, followed by a retrofit assessor certification with ECMK. And so we've been trying to understand what is the quickest way you can take someone from I've never heard of retrofit to I'm now qualified. And of course, as I said before, it's great that people have attained a qualification. The next question is, well, what does that mean? Now, the steps in between, of course, are also how do you get them to understand this space if they're coming from a different space, and actually helping them qualify neatly and painlessly and without having to do resits and doing the practical piece, which in the case of the DEA qual is a portfolio of submitting energy performance certificates and so on. So we've been building digital learning experiences to augment and support peer-to-peer learning around the formal qualification, which we don't deliver because there are plenty of people doing a brilliant job around delivering that. So how are we supporting the qualification period, as well as at the top of the funnel, as I mentioned, building that awareness and that interest in these roles. And ultimately, as people become qualified, so they've got their certificate, so on paper, they're a driver, but they've not driven often. We're then working with employers, as I said, most of which are small companies. And in so doing, what we understood quite quickly is that employers have objections about people that are qualified but not experienced. So if you think about the triangle between qualified, experienced, and competent, these are all slightly different things. Sometimes they are kind of entirely overlapping and sometimes they are not at all. So what we're really angling for here is people who are newly qualified, on paper, not experienced at all because they are newly qualified. And what we're trying to do is compensate for the fact they are newly qualified by inexperience by giving them very realistic experiences of what might happen in the first 3 months on the job. And the way that we've been thinking about that is through applied learning post-qualification. So everything around how you do condition reports through to what PAS 2035 will mean and so on. So it's to really kind of create that jumping off platform. And we build that learning with that employment in mind. So thinking about what are some of the bear traps that employers talk to us about all the time that we can then capture in this learning so as to get people that are qualified and on paper will be competent much faster than somebody who is coming at this entirely kind of off their own back. And so we've been placing people in the work on the back of that and working with employers as, if you like, a talent acquisition and L&D partner in parallel. But the key point here is that off the back of a program like this, what you're really talking about is 96% of the participants say that the energy transition and green job is very important to them, but a quarter of them are coming from minoritized background. More than half of them are coming out of unemployment to seize these opportunities. And then over a third of the ones that have completed replaced into work so far. And it gives you a sense of like how we're both building the competence and the confidence of these learners, but also then really bridging the route to employment. And so what's exciting about the new year is that I think we have to be quite tactful about two sides of the transaction, because what employers needs to really triangulate with what candidates are kind of bringing, and we need to try and create a fairly seamless journey by which people can go into that employment. And so maybe just to kind of give you a sense of how you might approach this and what it might look like through the lens of your direct or indirect kind of delivery of this. And so that's your tier one partners in the supply chain and kind of beyond. On a very kind of, prosaic level, kind of where do you start? Well, have a sense of what the ultimate kind of upside demand of what you're doing might look like and what that might drive by way of the workforce. And as a result, where you might be today. Now, that could be both about who do I have that could be deployed or redeployed in this, and what are their skills and are they matched to what, the task at hand is. And if not, then what can I do by way of kind of upskilling? And is that upskilling exclusively a training course, or is it more than a training course? And how do I think about upskilling as something that's continuous? Skills development is not just completing a training, it's actually continuously learning on a job and banking that, and in particular building on lessons and mistakes without making too many mistakes so as to actually compromise projects. And the other piece is how much of that is kind of happening in-house versus is there a value in getting some of this outsourced so that I can get workforce. And this is the business case, can I get this workforce faster and cheaper by doing something different here in terms of talent attraction and kind of learning and development and finding different partners that can support me for that. And so how do I get over some of the initial kind of bottlenecking that I might have for sort of spring upcoming, but also then how do I think about this as a sort of, 2 to 3 year journey where even in that context, the kind of the workforce demands might change, but also the available supply I might have of workers might change. And so how do I think about that in that context? But if you are a housing association or a local authority, you have huge kind of place-making opportunities. Of course, internally, you'll have colleagues who work across social value or your kind of foundation or your employment and skills piece. And therefore, you have that kind of systemic opportunity to bring different actors together that might be able to enable this project further. But from our side, I'm really happy to kind of share the different experiences that we've had. As I said, the majority of which have been about how do we shape this opportunity inclusively for that new talent that we so desperately need. Because if I kind of try and explain what's the risk of not doing so, we either don't have the talent at all, or if we do have the talent, we might have talent that is missing some of the things that we need it to have in a changing environment. Or we have talent, but because of a shortage of talent, we're paying over the odds to secure our talent. And as a result, our projects are still sort of hindered. And at the other end, as I said, of course, the needs of those employers who don't have a huge amount of kind of capacity to do lots of these things. And therefore, sometimes the apprenticeship levy route itself might not be the right route, especially given that some of these qualifications can be attained fairly quickly. And as I said, that's not to say that qualifications and skills and competence are the same thing, but it's something to think about. And the other piece is to think about, well, how might that environment be supported alongside a collaboration of partners to really have that workforce flourish and be in the best place to support these projects going on. But of course, ultimately, as the kind of theme suggests, that look at social value, also create that local benefit that is implicitly or explicitly required in these bids, and will ultimately make the project stronger because they have community involvement, community interest, community consent, and eventually kind of community benefit that marries up to, I think, partially or wholly the intent of where some of the public investment in this space is coming from. So on that note, it's probably best I kind of stop, and I'm really excited to get into discussion and answer any questions you might have, either generally about the kind of the the way that we've kind of unpacked this challenge, or about our work specifically, and where there might be opportunities for collaboration.